The PDH Pod podcast is a great source of PDH news, tips, and tricks, so don't forget to check it out. It is available on this channel and almost anywhere you find podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe for more PDH content, and like this video. It really helps us out with the YouTube algorithm and doesn't cost you anything. Now let's get started. Wheels is playing Kalain, Reclusive Painter, a legendary 1/2 elf bard with when Kalain, Reclusive Painter enters the battlefield, create a treasure token, and other creatures you control enter the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on them for each mana from a treasure spent to cast them. Pauper's Commander is Jubilant Skybonder, a 2/2 with flying, and creatures you control with flying have spells your opponents cast that target this creature cost 2 more to cast. Bradrak V is on Mischievous Chimera, a 2/2 with flying, and whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, Mischievous Chimera deals 1 damage to each opponent. Scry 1. And finally, Too Much Do is on Kagha, Shadow Druid, a legendary 1/4 elf druid with whenever Kagha, Shadow Druid, attacks, it gains Death Touch until end of turn. Mill 2 cards. And once during each of your turns, you may play a land or cast a permanent spell from among cards in your graveyard that were put there from your library this turn. Wheel starts the game with a mountain and passes. Lobert plays Razortide Bridge tapped. Brad plays Command Tower. Too Much Do plays Haunted Mire tapped. Wales plays another mountain, casts Arcane Signet, and passes. Lobert plays a Plains and Ornithopter of Paradise. Brad plays Island, then Firebrand Archer. Too Much Do plays Tranquil Thicket tapped, and enchants it with Wild Growth. Wales plays Basilisk Gate, followed by Network Terminal, which he uses to play his commander, Kalain, Reclusive Painter. Lobert plays Secluded Step tapped, and his commander, Jubilant Skybonder. Brad taps 2 for Mischievous Chimera, and passes. Too Much Do plays Snow-Covered Forest, Sakura Tribe Elder, and Priest of the Haunted Edge. On Too Much Do's end step, Brad casts Gut Shot for 2 life, targeting Wales. Firebrand Archer triggers, dealing 1 damage to each of Brad's opponents. Mischievous Chimera triggers at the same time, dealing another 1 damage to his opponents and allows him to scry a card to the bottom. Wales plays Path of Ancestry tapped, uses Basilisk Gate to play Ceremonial Knife. He taps his remaining 2 lands and his treasure to play Undercity Scrounger, which enters with a +1/+1 counter due to Kalain. Wales passes. Lobert plays Arkham's Astrolabe, draws a card, and plays Thriving Heath, naming blue, and then casts Godpharaoh's Faithful. He attacks Too Much Do for 2 and ends his turn. Brad draws for turn and passes. At the end of his turn, Too Much Do sacrifices Sakura Tribe Elder, putting a snow-covered swamp into play tapped. He then takes his turn, playing his commander, Kagha, Shadow Archdruid, and enchants it with Kaya's Ghost Form. He taps and sacrifices Priest of the Haunted Edge to give Jubilant Skybonder -X/-X until end of turn, where X is the number of snow lands he controls. Circumventing Jubilant Skybonder's ability, it dies. Too Much Do passes. Wales takes his turn, plays a Barrenmoor tapped, taps 2 to equip Kalain with Ceremonial Knife, and attacks Brad with his 2/2 commander. Brad blocks with his 2/1 Firebrand Archer. Wales plays Feign Death, which will allow Kalain to return to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter if it dies. Brad plays Dive Down on Firebrand Archer, giving it +0/+3 and hexproof until end of turn. Combat damage happens, Kalain dies and returns to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter, making a treasure. Wales uses his remaining lands to play Tavern Brawler and passes. Lobert plays Shimmerdrift Vale, naming blue, and pays 5 for Jubilant Skybonder. Brad plays Silver Bluff Bridge, tapped, and goes to combat, attacking Wales with his flying commander for 2. Too Much Do untaps and attacks Brad with Kagha. Kagha triggers, which gives itself Death Touch and mills Too Much Do for 2. Forge of Heroes and Tortured Existence go into his graveyard. In his second main phase, he plays Tortured Existence from his graveyard with Kagha's second ability, and then Executioner's Capsule from his hand. He then passes. Wales starts his turn and triggers Tavern Brawler, which exiles Raging Redcap, a 1/2 with double strike. He gives Kalain power equal to its mana value, 3. He draws for turn and plays Pestilence. After it enters the battlefield, Wales activates it, dealing 1 damage to each creature and each player. Firebrand Archer dies. He activates it a second time, killing Jubilant Skybonder, Ornithopter of Paradise, and Mischievous Chimera. He then attacks Lobert for 5 with Kalain, and Brad for 2 with Undercity Scrounger. Neither of them block. Lobert casts Oblivion Ring on his turn, which exiles Pestilence, and then plays a Terramorphic Expanse, which he uses to put a snow-covered island into play. Brad plays Mountain, and then Thunderdrake. Too Much Do plays Snow-Covered Forest, which he uses to ward Avenging Hunter.
He gains the initiative, which puts a snow-covered swamp into his hand. He then enchants Kagha with Rancor, giving it +2/+0 and trample. He attacks Brad with Kagha, which triggers, giving itself Death Touch, and mills Command Sphere and Balustrade Spy. He then passes. Wales triggers Tavern Brawler, exiling Scion of Halaster, giving Kalain +2 power until end of turn. Wales draws, and plays Scion of Halaster before attacking Lobert with a 4-power Kalain. Lobert blocks with Godpharaoh's Faithful, which dies. Post-combat, Wales activates Undercity Scrounger to make a treasure. He uses the treasure for Arcbound Tracker, which enters the battlefield with an additional 2 +1/+1 counters due to Kalain. Lobert untaps and pays 5 for Moldrifter. He plays a Plains, and then casts Journey to Nowhere. When it enters, it targets Kalain. In response, Wales activates Network Terminal, tapping Ceremonial Knife. He looks at the top 2 due to Scion of Halaster, putting Hoarding Ogre into his graveyard and the other card into his hand.
Wales activates a blood token, drawing a card and discarding a card.
Journey to Nowhere resolves, and Kalain is exiled. Lobert passes. Brad casts Lightning Bolt on Wales, and then casts Izzet Charm, choosing to draw 2 and discard 2. Thunderdrake gets a +1/+ counter because Izzet Charm was Brad's second spell. Brad plays a mountain and passes. Too Much Dew progresses through the dungeon due to the initiative, putting 2 +1/+1 counters on Kagha. He draws his card for turn, and then goes to combat. He attacks Brad with Kagha, and Lobert with Avenging Hunter. Kagha mills Underworld Charger and a Swamp. Brad and Lobert each take 5. After combat, he plays Underworld Charger through Kagha's ability, and then casts Chain Devil, which Brad counters with Lose Focus. Too Much Dew is unable to pay the 2, so Chain Devil is countered. Wales begins his turn, and goes straight into combat, attacking Too Much Dew with Arcbound Tracker. Underworld Charger is unable to block, so Too Much Dew takes 4 damage. Wales takes the initiative, which puts a swamp into his hand. In his second main phase, he plays Kalain for 4, which creates a treasure. He then plays Coronation of Chaos, which goads Kagha, Underworld Charger, and Thunderdrake. He lays down a Mortuary Mire, which moves Hoarding Ogre from his graveyard to the top of his library. He ends his turn. Lobert plays Angel of Dawn, which gives his creatures +1/+1 in vigilance until end of turn. He attacks Wales with Moldrifter and gains the initiative, which he uses to put an island into his hand. He plays a Terramorphic Expanse and sacrifices it to put an island into play. Brad untaps and plays Mischievous Chimera for 4. He follows that by enchanting it with a Robe of Mirrors, which gives it Shroud. He goes to combat and attacks Too Much Dew with his goated Thunderdrake. Too Much Dew takes 4. Brad passes. Too Much Dew casts Summon Undead, which mills 3 of his own cards, and allows him to return a creature from his graveyard to the battlefield. He chooses Chain Devil. Too Much Dew sacrifices Underworld Charger. Wales sacrifices Arcbound Tracker. Lobert sacrifices Moldrifter, and Brad sacrifices Mischievous Chimera. Too Much Dew goes to combat and attacks Brad with Kagha and Lobert with Avenging Hunter. Kagha triggers, milling Abundant Growth and a Forest. Lobert uses Blink of an Eye to return Avenging Hunter to Too Much Dew's hand. After combat, Too Much Dew casts Abundant Growth from his graveyard onto his swamp, which draws him a card. On his end step, Wales creates a treasure with Undercity Scrounger. Wales untaps and triggers Tavern Brawler, revealing the Hoarding Ogre that he put on top of his library. Its mana value is 4, so Kalain becomes a 5/2. Scion of Halaster allows him to look at the top 2 cards of his library, put Opal Palace into his graveyard, and the other into his hand. He casts Goldvein Pick and equips it to Kalain. He uses his 2 treasures to cast Hoarding Ogre, which enters with 2 +1/+1 counters due to Kalain, and equips Ceremonial Knife to Kalain. He attacks Too Much Dew with Undercity Scrounger and Kalain. Too Much Dew blocks with Chain Devil and takes 6. Lobert progresses through the Undercity, which puts 2 +1/+1 counters on Angel of Dawn. He plays Island, Angelic Renewal, and Custody Squire. Lobert votes for Godpharaoh's Faithful. Brad votes for Moldrifter. Too Much Dew votes for Ornithopter of Paradise, and Wales votes for Ornithopter of Paradise as well. So Ornithopter of Paradise is returned to his hand, and he plays it. He attacks Wales for 5 with his Angel of Dawn, and passes. Brad starts his turn and draws Scattered Thoughts, which lets him look at the top 4 cards of his library, put 2 into his hand, and 2 into his graveyard, and he passes. Too Much Dew draws, and discards Eyeblight Colors to activate Tortured Existence, targeting Chain Devil. He casts it, and Brad counters it with Arcane Denial. He attacks Lobert with Kagha, which triggers, making it a 6/6 with Trample and Death Touch. Snow-Covered Swamp and Moldrevine Cloak are milled, and Lobert takes 6. Too Much Dew gains the initiative, which deals 5 more damage to Lobert. Too Much Dew plays the Snow-Covered Swamp and passes. On his end step, Wales sacrifices a blood token to discard a swamp and draw a card. Wales begins his turn. Arcane Denial and Tavern Brawler trigger. Arcane Denial makes Brad draw 1 and Too Much Do draw 2. Supernatural Stamina is exiled to Tavern Brawler, so Kalain gets +1/+0. He draws for turn and enchants Kalain with Sticky Fingers, which gives it Menace, and create a treasure token when the enchanted creature does combat damage to a player. He attacks Lobert with everything. Hoarding Ogre triggers. Wales rolls an 8, so he creates a treasure. Lobert blocks Undercity Scrounger with Ornithopter of Paradise, and Hoarding Ogre with Custody Squire. Wales plays Supernatural Stamina on Kalain to eliminate Lobert. Wales creates 2 treasures and a blood token from Kalain dealing damage, and Pestilence returns to the battlefield. Note, this was a mistake. Lobert is no longer in the game, so his Oblivion Ring can't trigger to return Pestilence to the battlefield. Brad starts his turn by playing Big Score, discarding a mountain. He creates 2 treasures and draws 2. He enchants Kalain with Deep Freeze, making it a base 0/4 wall with Defender. Brad attacks Wales with his 5/6 with Flying. Wales activates Pestilence 6 more times.
All creatures other than Undercity Scrounger die.
Wales draws a card due to Sticky Fingers, and Kagha returns to the battlefield due to Kaya's ghost form. Too Much Do begins his turn, progresses through the dungeon, choosing to draw a card, which he replaces with the Dredge from Moldervine Cloak. He mills a snow-covered swamp and Scion of Halaster, and draws for turn. He discards a creature to Tortured Existence to return Chain Devil to his hand, which he casts. Too Much Do sacrifices Chain Devil, and Wales sacrifices Undercity Scrounger. Too Much Do attacks Wales with Kagha, which mills Barrenmoor and Writhing Necromass. Wales dies to combat damage. Using Kagha, he plays Writhing Necromass for 1, because he has 8 creatures in his graveyard. Brad draws a card for turn and concedes.
Thank you for watching until the end. Please don't forget to check out the PDH Pod podcast, like, and subscribe.